So this week we have Dr. Helena Posthumus. She's from Wageningen Center for Development Innovation, so she's a colleague of us. She'll be going deeper into the food system analysis and to the concepts and theory behind it.
Thank you, Bram. I just need to find the right screen to share so you can see my slides. And welcome everyone who's here online. It's really great to see you all. I want to cut my presentations. Basically, it's 4 parts where I'll introduce the topic first. Then I'll have a few slides on systems thinking, because that is very important when we talk about food systems, that we use a systems thinking lens. In the third section, I want to say a little bit about the food system decision support toolbox that we developed in the last couple of years. And it's also available to you through Curator, and then some final thoughts on the food system approach. So 4 blocks. I hope I'll get through it in time, but Bram will warn me if I'm taking too long. So, as an introduction, the food systems concept, the definitions, I may be repeating some things that you already know, that you maybe heard last week, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Of course, is it a new concept of food systems? Everyone is talking about it these days. It really became integrated into debates from 2016, 2017 onwards, when some large influential reports came out and that started talking about food systems from the WNF, from FAO, from UNEP. And of course, the Food Systems Summit was a major event to also put food systems on the global map, and in all the discussions that have been held before that and after that, whether it's in boardrooms or policy makers discussing policies, or researchers, or I think almost everywhere I hear the word food systems coming up. But is it new? A lot of the thinking in value chain development, integrated rural development, farming systems, it's all sort of coming together in this whole food systems concept. So it's not completely new, but it's a useful way to bring different ideas, experiences together in one concept. Is it a handy concept? If you see pictures like this, you get confused. Where do you start? It's referring almost to everything under the sun related to food. So is it still handy? Because we can also risk losing the overview and losing sites on where to intervene if we want to improve food and nutrition security. To be sure, this is probably something you know, that you've been reading about, that you heard before, but this is how, at least at Wageningen University and Research, we define a food system. It's all elements and activities from production to consumption of food, as well as markets, institutions that govern the system. It results in outcomes. And when a few years back, the focus was still primarily on food and nutrition security as an outcome, but increasingly there's also more attention to other socioeconomic and environmental impacts of food systems. Think of biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on. And an important element is also the food system actors. So it's not just about the activities, but it's actually about those who are working in a food system, are whether it's as a producer or a processor or a researcher or a policymaker or a regulator. There are many different actors, and of course consumers, and we all are consumers. So you could say we have 7 billion or maybe more, 8 billion actors in the food system to consider. It's all segments in society that depend on parts of the food systems, and that's basically every one of us, if you think about it. So we are not just observers or people on the sideline, we are all ourselves part of the food system one way or another. And at least here in Wageningen University and Research, we often refer to this map to sort of simplify a little bit the concept, where we say we have our activities, we have our supply chains, the businesses around that, the enabling environment, we have socioeconomic drivers of policy, markets, science and technology that influence these activities. You have environmental drivers, climate, water, biodiversity, that influence these activities, but also the other way around, because they're both drivers and outcomes. And then, of course, we have the outcomes, the results that we as society expect from a food system, and the main one is food and nutrition security. But in recent years, there's also a new frameworks being developed, and we know that all these pieces of the puzzle need to fit, and they influence each other positively or negatively. So there's lots of non-linear relationships there. And in terms of outcomes, there's now more attention. I think Sustainable Development Goals in general, we also look at what's the outcome of employment, of poverty alleviation, of biodiversity, if we consider our food systems. So that's very briefly on food systems, because I am assuming you know this, so I'm going through it very quickly. But I want to spend a little bit more time on systems thinking and the concept of systems thinking, because that, to me, makes the difference when we talk about food systems or food system analysis or food system approaches. It's to take really the systems perspective. And the reason is that we have to deal with wicked problems. So what is a wicked problem? A simple problem could be fixing a bike. If in the Netherlands we use our bikes a lot, if I have a flat tire, I know the problem. I'm certain that my tire is flat. I can see it, I can feel it. I know how to fix it. And if I would ask my neighbor to help, he would agree with me how to fix it. So a simple problem, we are more or less certain how to deal with it, and we agree amongst ourselves how to deal with it. A difficult problem has maybe a bit less certainty, less agreement. It's like building a rocket to fly to the moon. It's a bit more complicated. We need to bring different experiences together. But a wicked problem is where we maybe not certain how to solve the problem. So if we are just gardening and we have a plant disease, or a plant is not doing well, we're not sure if it's a disease or if it's lack of fertilizer, or if it's plants are not compatible, or there's something wrong with the soil, whatever. It's the weather. There can be different reasons why we have a problem in our garden, in our kitchen garden. And there may also be disagreement between myself and my neighbor, for example, or my brother who comes to advise me on how to solve the problem. So a wicked problem or complex problems are situations where we know there is an issue, there is some improvement needed, but we disagree between ourselves what's the solution, or we are not certain if we try this, what will be the outcome. So if we talk about biodiversity loss, if we talk about climate change, if we talk about food and nutrition security, if we talk about growing inequality in our countries, globally also, we know it's a problem, but we may disagree amongst each other what's the effective solution or how should we solve this. And that's where we have to deal with wicked problems, and we need to use a systems lens. Maybe another way to explain the difference between a difficult and a wicked problem. If we have a difficult problem, we want to fly to the moon, we need to build a rocket, we have a clear priority, we have a number of solutions we can distinguish. It can be treated as a standalone matter in the sense that we can build a rocket. We don't need to consider other events. We have a limited number of people involved. We have the knowledge to know how to build it, and we have a time scale that we can solve it. But if we have a wicked problem, what typically happens is that different stakeholders will question priorities or will have different priorities. What do we need to focus on first? They're not necessarily obvious solutions or solutions that all agree on. The problem itself, it's part of the context, is part of the problem. And typically there are many people involved with many opinions, with many interests, with many different types of knowledge, with different options to make a difference. So, and the situation keeps evolving. So it's something that you can observe, and that happens, and you need to respond and react, but you cannot really control it, manage it. And that's what we have to deal with when we talk about food systems. So Another way, you may have seen this picture of this elephant and then the people trying to figure out what is this that we're dealing with. And some will say it's a wall, it's a spear, it's a snake, depending on the part that they are looking at, or that they are, in this case, actually, they are only touching the parts of the elephant. But the system is that sometimes we only look at a part, at an element, at a component, but the system is the elephant. That's a way of understanding systems approaches. The other way you could look at this picture, though, is wondering, normally I would just look at this picture and I would see the different parts of the elephant, and okay, the system is the elephant. People look at a part of the elephant, and if you put the pieces together, you have an elephant. Lately, I started looking at this picture and I thought, actually, what's happening with all these people in the picture? Why are they just blindfolded? Why are they only looking at one part? Why don't they group and come together as a group and take some distance and discuss what they see together? So a system is also often linked to, as I already said, there are many actors, and to understand the system, you need to work together as an actor to understand it. So there's a multi-stakeholder collaboration often that is required to both understand the system and to talk about, if there is an issue, if there's a problem, what would be an appropriate solution. So there's very much a social element to systems thinking. It's not just we have a puzzle and we have different pieces and we put them together and we understand it. It's also about people, the actors involved. A third strand of systems thinking, and this comes more from systems dynamics theory, is that even when you look at a system, it changes, things happen. This is a static picture of an elephant, but if we would make a video and you have one person pulling his tail and another person pulling his ears or whatever, then the elephant will respond. Something will happen. It will start shaking off people. It may run away. Same with when we talk about the food system. As soon as we start to intervene, something happens because we're part of the decisions that are being taken, the interventions that are being taken in the system. So we cannot detach ourselves from it. So it's dynamic. It has a behavior. Every system has a behavior, and it responds and it changes and it evolves over time, even when we discuss it and look at it or try to intervene. So to say a little bit more about emergence, because this may be a concept that is new to some of you, but it's important in systems thinking, is that, okay, you may have a system, and the best way to compare it with is, for example, a game of chess. There are certain rules of the game, and we know the rules, and there are rules about where you need to put each piece on the board. There are rules about how you can move each piece. There's a rule about we take turns in moving a piece, and there's a rule about who wins and who loses. We know when someone has won the game. Those are agreed rules. They are clear. But at the same time, there's an element in this game of chess. If you play it with someone else, every step is a decision in itself, and you respond and you react. So even though the rules of the game is always the same, the outcome of the game, depending with whom you are playing and what decisions you made in the game, is always different. And this is emergence. It's recognizing that, yes, we may have rules of the game, but the actors who are agents in the system, they have their own behavior, their own values, their own beliefs, they make decisions, and that will result in something new. So even when you intervene with a project or a policy or an innovation coming out of research, as soon as you engage in the system, you have an influence and others react to that. There is an action-reaction element going on, dynamic going on. So you can never predict what will happen, and you cannot control what will happen. That is the concept of emergence, and that's why we need systems thinking, to keep observing, to look at patterns, at behaviors, to be aware of the decisions that are being made and the power or the agency that the different actors have, and to take opportunities for change when they present themselves. But you cannot predict this beforehand. That's the main message I want to give, talking about emergence. Another way to present systems thinking is to use this iceberg model, which you may have seen. And I think Bram will also talk about this a little bit later. It comes from Daniela Meadows, who is a systems thinker. It has been around for quite a while. But often what happens is we see something happening, there's an event, and we respond. You will notice everyone is affected by it. There is a war or a conflict going on in Russia, Ukraine. It has an effect on our food prices. It has an effect on our fertilizer prices across the globe and our energy prices. What do we do? Often we look at, there's a rising price in fertilizer, for example. Maybe increase the subsidies that we have, make more funding available for subsidies, and that's how we react to what we observe to deal with the crisis. But underneath, and I think especially in the last couple of years with the COVID crisis, with the climate change crisis, with the energy crisis, we start to realize that's just putting a plaster somewhere, but it's not really addressing the real problem. We need to dig deeper. We need to understand the trends. Why are things happening? How can it be that a conflict in one part of the world has an immediate effect on food prices in another part of the world? So we are becoming more and more aware. We need to understand the trends in the system of prices, but also structures. How can it be that an event happening in one part in the world has an effect in another part of the world? What are the feedback loops in our system, the interactions in our system that cause this? We call these systemic structures that really look at how the different parts of a system have an effect in each other, the patterns, and even the behavior that the system may have. And if I talk about behavior, I think one of the type of system behavior that many of you know is the theory on the tragedy of the commons. That's a typical type of system behavior, that to solve an issue of declining biodiversity loss or declining natural resources, we need to have a collective approach, because the individual approach is to take your own benefits and not perhaps worry so much about the collective. And if you really go down the iceberg, underneath it all are our values, our mental models, how we see the world, how do we believe the world should operate. And that really drives a lot of those system structures. So if we really want to transform food systems, we need to start thinking about what is the underlying beliefs that we have collectively that result in the food system that we have. And a lot of the global food system in previous decades has been focusing on efficiency. How can we make our global value chains efficient? So food is cheap, so food can be transported across the world. And now there's a shift in thinking that there's more focus on resilience rather than efficiency. Maybe we've become too efficient, and we need to take a few steps back and think about resilience and have stocks in place and have a bit of a combination of local and global food systems to make sure that these knock-on effects globally that we have witnessed, all of us, in the recent years, maybe we can buffer them a little bit by paying more attention to resilience. Energy transition, more awareness about climate change. These are all changes in our mental models about what we value and what we believe is important. So all this thinking resulted in a food systems analysis and an approach for a food system analysis. In Wageningen University and research with colleagues at another organization, KIT in the Netherlands, and also colleagues of NFP, we started this, and even the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we started this journey about 5 years ago, thinking about, there's this concept, how do we apply it? How can we use this concept to think through programs, interventions, to make an analysis of a food system? How can we operationalize this concept? And that is that's ultimately resulted in this toolbox, and it also influenced this e-course, where we've been thinking through how can we look at these different elements of a system and what tools do we have for this analysis. And I think I can go through this quite quickly because I saw there's also a video on Curator and the entire toolbox, I think, is available to you, so you can also read this. But we designed it in a few steps, this analysis. First of all, define your policy objectives or your objectives and what you want to achieve in this food system analysis and the food system itself. But then take some time to understand who are really the actors, what do they do, why do they do it, how is the governance of the food system. And this is about relationships, about interests, about power. It's all in this element of understanding really the social dimension of a food system. There is a part looking at characteristics. What are the food system outcomes in terms of food and nutrition security? What elements are important? What are the activities, the trends? How can we analyze that? And then there's a part about system behavior. So this is not individual behavior, but really how do different stakeholders, components react to each other? What are the feedback loops? What are the system behaviors, the causalities in this? Because we think this is relevant. It's going deeper with that iceberg, going down deeper the iceberg. If we find certain spots then in that system that we think if we flip this switch, it has a knock-on effect for other parts. So it's trying to understand how things are interrelated, to find a leverage point, we call it, where if we make a change there, it will have the knock-on effects in a system that we want to achieve. Now, this may sound a bit vague and abstract, but in the next presentation of Bram, he will actually go a bit deeper into this and also show how they have done it. Once you have an understanding of all this, then you can move on to your recommendations from analysis to action. Now, what do we do? So in the toolbox itself, you will find many examples of exercises, tools, and we structured it in such a way that we have some tools you can do in a setting with other stakeholders in a workshop just to be aware of certain things, and it's low cost, you don't need to spend too much time except from getting people together, to analytical tools, which is basically things you could do if you would have a research project. Because how long should an analysis take? How much should you invest? Well, it depends on the resources you have, and we try to give options depending on your situation. There are 3 principles that we feel are very important if you do a food system analysis. One is, I've already talked about, is systems thinking, being aware that elements are connected, that it's not a linear, if I do this, then that will happen, but there are unexpected feedback loops, there are unexpected events may happen as soon as you start to intervene. So that concept of emergence. So synthesis, looking at relationship, looking at connections, that is really important in this. Another part we find very important at Wageningen is the stakeholder involvement, because it affects all of us. So if you are a policymaker or a researcher, you cannot change that system by yourself. There are other people who are affected. There are other people who have perspectives on what should be changed, to also have power to change things or to oppose the change that you want to bring. So it's better to invite a diversity of voices to the table when we talk about food system interventions, to engage stakeholders, make sure that do we have a similar understanding of the problem, the issues, but also the actions that need to be taken. So yeah, these can come from different sectors, from different levels, from different, we call them social markers, so different social groups, and we can engage them through different methods. But it's not something, it's easier said than done. So if you do this, if you engage on a multi-stakeholder intervention, be sure that you have the right facilitation also for this process. A third principle that we find very important, this is not necessarily that everyone who talks about food systems will talk about this, but we find that it's important, is equity and inclusion. Because of the growing inequality, and we know that, of course, food and nutrition security is closely linked to poverty, but also who has power to make a difference for themselves is also about who has power to make a change, or whether it's in terms of related to poverty or to social status. I think we all know that the growing inequality we observe is a big part of the problem. So in our toolbox, we feel it's important to, whenever you do an analysis or prepare an intervention, think about who has access to the resources, who has decision-making power, who benefits from the outcomes, who is losing out, who is excluded, and how do institutions drive inequity. And this could be institutions, could be regulations, could be policies, but could also be norms, cultural norms, for example. To make sure that we understand the difference between equality and equity. Equality is where we give everyone the same input, you could say. So in our picture, each person here gets the same box. It's very fair, you could say. But the box, the outcomes is still different for each person. So yes, the box helps maybe for those two larger individuals. They can now watch the game, they can look over the fence. But this poor little guy is still just confronted with a fence and cannot see the game. Equity means that the outcomes are equal for everyone. So in this case, the smaller guy, he needs two boxes to be able to enjoy the same outcome as the larger guy, basically watching the game. Now, if we really want to transform the system, we just remove the fence. It's liberation. They can just, with who they are, the means that they have, they can all watch the game. This is the ideal picture, you could say.
Helena, we have 5 minutes left.
Great, thanks. The reality, unfortunately, is that in real life, the bigger guy has more resources. The smaller guy is sometimes he's stuck in a hole. So there's a lot to do when we talk about equity and social inclusion. Leverage points, I'll keep this very brief, but in the next presentation, we will come back to this, so don't worry. But basically, leverage points is about, think again about the iceberg. The deeper we go, if we make a shift somewhere deeper down the iceberg, the effect will be larger than if we're just responding to symptoms and events. So the trick is a little bit in finding the spot in the system where with less effort you can have major effects rather than trying to change everything. And that can be done, for example, through finding also innovations that are available maybe somewhere in the system that you think if we can really accelerate this, outscale this, it will have a positive effect on the long-term outcomes of the system. But the other part of it is that think about, so yes, you need to find your spots in the system. Where can we make a difference to achieve the desirable outcomes? But of course, you need to think about what is also in this story, my mandate, my objective. How can I influence that? Or maybe if I cannot influence this, with whom can I partner? Find a coalition of the willing to make a difference. Next presentation will give you some examples, I think. A few final thoughts. Having now been working in this area and discussing this with many people over the past 5-6 years, some thoughts I wanted to share. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time. But one question that often comes up now, will a food system analysis result in more or better impact, better interventions or not? What is the difference? And I think when we started out with this, for us, the main aim is really to broaden your thinking about food systems using a systems lens and get new perspectives on problems and solutions. It's not a magic bullet and you say, oh, I use this method and now I will have more impact. It's really to open up your mind, understand how is this system operating. So to understand the bigger picture, which will help you to make informed priority setting and to justify decisions and interventions. It will help you to understand all the different processes that can either accelerate or oppose the impact of your intervention. And in that sense, it's important, if you're familiar with this, to enrich your theory of change. And it is a way, it's a tool to engage stakeholders even in decision-making process, in understanding the issues, exchanging on that, come to a joint action plan. So that is really how we see this as an approach, as a helpful tool. What is maybe a bit worrying in my view is it's now also being used as a normative tool, saying we need food system transformation, and there seems to be an underlying assumption we can transform food systems with a project, we can control it, and my whole argument is we cannot. The system itself evolves, but if we are more aware of how it evolves, we can steer, intervene, yes, but we cannot control it or manage it. We cannot manage a transformation. A transformation happens from within. Do we always need to use a food system approach? No, only if it's a wicked problem. But if the solution is obvious to all, you don't need to do a food system analysis necessarily. If you can solve the problem by yourself, you don't need to do a food system analysis necessarily. These are the maybe complicated or simple problems that I started off with. If you do not have the means or the mandate or the capacity or the motivation to really use the collaborative multi-stakeholder approach, maybe also think twice whether a food system analysis is going to help you. Or if you already know what your design, your intervention will be, and it has a very single focus, then also maybe you don't need to do a food system analysis first if you already know what you're going to do. We had a few years back, there was a community of practice on food systems with the Netherlands Food Partnership. It was still a food business and knowledge platform at the time, and we also jointly reflected a little bit on the food system approaches we were using, the actions that we were familiar with. And these were some of the conclusions of that reflection that I want to share with you. We said it's essential, if you talk about multi-stakeholder collaborations, food system approaches, don't only invite the usual suspects because they already have a voice at the table often, but include local perspective, include some stakeholders that normally are not part of the discussion. But at the same time, work with organizations that are legitimate and that they can take action, that they can actually move things in the system. And of course, we're always looking for win-win or win-win-win solutions, but often they don't exist. As soon as you change something, there's always someone who's losing out. So be open and honest about trade-offs, tensions that may exist. Try to negotiate it. Some of the good practices that we agreed upon was to really work together with stakeholders to create a common vision. Where do we want to go together in this food system that we are operating? Be explicit about the objectives. Create ownership among the stakeholders. And this requires a lot of investment to build trust. Work with those who are change makers, who are willing to change. Form a coalition with those who want to move and can move. And try to keep others motivated to come with you. But be aware of your own resources, the limits to it also. Make an action plan and try to combine short-term actions and short-term wins with long-term goals of transformation. That's what I wanted to say, Bram, for now. So I'll stop here.